Some old cases disappear from the newspapers, others vanish from official archives. But there are those that remain as a silent shadow between the pages of time. Before we begin, the narrator leaves just one simple observation for the viewer, almost a whisper between documents. Note in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is there now. After that, the story returns to its usual silence. Among the most studied accounts from Redmoor County, there is one that always causes particular discomfort among researchers: the disappearance of 19 guests during a winter night in 1876, inside a property that, on maps of the time, was identified as Redmoor Estate, belonging to the Ashbury family. But, curiously, local archives do not treat the event as a collective tragedy, but rather as the consequence of a private ritual of domestic discipline kept under strict secrecy for decades. At the center of it all were the daughters of the family, now known in historical literature as the Redmoor daughters. The oldest documents describe the Ashbury sisters as austere figures. Margaret, the eldest, born in 1853, known for her rigid posture and dislike of unnecessary conversation. Eloise, born in 1855, introspective, keeper of the household records. And Clara, the youngest, born in 1859, remembered by neighbors as the only one with traces of lightness, though deeply marked by family pressures. There is no mention of their mother, only scattered notes suggesting an early death, probably between 1863 and 1865, during a fever that devastated several families in the region. Their father, Edmund Ashbury, was described as a stern man, dedicated to maintaining an impeccable reputation at a time when family honor carried more weight than any emotional bond. The Ashbury estate was known for its size and a kind of somber elegance. A dark stone mansion with narrow windows and grounds that, even in the few preserved photographs, convey a sense of uninhabited vastness. Behind the mansion, according to inventories from 1872, there was a secondary basement, separate from the main one, referred to in the records as a discipline cellar, a kind of underground cell adapted for domestic punishment, an unfortunately common feature at the time among strict aristocratic families. The Redmoor community was not large. Farmers, woodcutters, small traders, most depended on the land and on the quiet and restrained social relations typical of isolated settlements in rural northeast England. The weather that winter of 1876 had been particularly harsh. Newspapers mentioned biting winds from the north, higher than expected snowfall, and roads partially closed for days on end. All of this contributed to many minor events remaining within the properties without much circulation of information. Even so, one annual event broke the monotony of the season: the Ashbury Winter Banquet, always held on the last Saturday in January. It was an occasion that brought together neighbors, nearby merchants, and a few travelers recommended by correspondents. It was not exactly a ball, nor a popular party. It was a quiet, almost ceremonial tradition, where the family reinforced its image of order, discipline, and prestige. In 1876, 19 guests were present, all duly recorded in one of Eloise's notebooks, partially preserved in the municipal archive. According to the documents, the banquet began at dusk and would continue into the early hours of the morning. However, further investigation found a disturbing discrepancy. None of the 19 names reappear in official records after that night. There are no letters sent, receipts, mentions in newspapers, commercial transactions, nothing. It is as if they all disappeared simultaneously without leaving a trace. The most disturbing detail, however, appears on a loose page from the 1881 archives, found decades later among the county files. The unsigned sheet contains only one sentence, written in shaky handwriting: "They shouldn't have gone down to sea." This isolated line, buried among forgotten documents, marks the beginning of the mystery that this script attempts to reconstruct. What exactly was in the basement known as the Silent Punishment Cellar? Who went down there? And why did none of the guests from that night ever reappear? These questions have remained unanswered for almost a century and a half, and it is in this prolonged silence that the story of the Redmoor daughters begins to unfold. Slowly, like ancient dust stirred by careful hands. To understand the disappearance of the 19 guests, we must go back a few weeks before the night of the banquet, to a seemingly ordinary period, but one that, in the preserved accounts, already hinted at a silent tension within the Ashbury family. Neighbors' records, especially testimonies collected in the 1890s, describe that winter as the harshest of the decade. The snow not only covered the ground, it seemed to impose an even deeper silence on the activities of Redmoor County. The routine at the mansion began before dawn. The eldest of the sisters, Margaret, had taken her mother's place at a very young age. She was the one who organized the house and managed relationships with suppliers and workers. Many said she spoke little, but that every word seemed carefully calculated. Eloise, on the other hand, who was responsible for the property's records, was rarely seen outside the house. Her name appears in account books, guest lists, receipts, and meticulous notes on small expenses. Some of these documents subtly reveal corrections made with urgency, as if something in her oscillated between precision and a discreet kind of restlessness. Clara, the youngest, was the only one who more openly frequented the community. There were reports that she visited the local school to deliver donations and sometimes helped prepare meals for families affected by seasonal fever. It was through these reports that the image of a young woman torn between the weight of family traditions and an almost invisible desire to escape them was constructed. A neighbor, interviewed in 1904, described Clara as someone who always seemed to look back before smiling, a phrase that has long intrigued historians. The Ashburys' daily life, however rigid, maintained an appearance of normality. Workers circulated around the property, delivered firewood, tended the stables, and were paid on time. The father, Edmund, already ill, remained in the north wing of the mansion, rarely seen outside his chambers. Medical records indicate that his health had been rapidly deteriorating since the end of 1875, which is why much of the responsibility fell on his 3 daughters. But there were signs, small, discreet ones, that something was not as it should be. One of the workers, interviewed decades later, reported that in the first weeks of January, the lights in the mansion remained on until well after midnight. He claimed to hear, in the distance, unusual movements coming from the secondary basement. Footsteps, furniture being dragged, and sometimes even small echoes like muffled voices. Other neighbors mentioned seeing Clara walking alone on the grounds, even in the intense cold, with her hands tucked into her coat and her head down, as if mentally repeating some dialogue or instruction. None of these details, taken individually, were particularly noteworthy, but when placed side by side, they form the first layer of strangeness. The preparations for the annual banquet also differed from previous years. Eloise noted in her notebook that, for that edition, there would be special protocols for reception and accommodation. However, she did not specify what that meant. She just adjusted the guest list, crossing out 2 names, adding 3, and noting next to them, "Confirm attendance in person, no letters." This instruction does not appear in any of the previous years. Another curious point appears in Margaret's notes. On a page almost erased by time, it reads, "Ensure that the east wing is locked before the visitors arrive." There is no explanation for this rule, nor any indication that the wing was under renovation or unsafe. The inventories of the time do not mention any structural damage that would justify its isolation. The sisters' behavior also began to attract the attention of those who were allowed to enter the house. A local seamstress, who adjusted some dresses for the event, described the atmosphere inside as heavy, stifling, as if the house were waiting for something. She reported that Clara asked her to finish the job quickly, and that Eloise, throughout the session, did not look up from her notebook, taking frantic notes on seemingly irrelevant items: fabric used, schedules, outside temperatures, light variations. There is also a particularly intriguing record. 4 days before the banquet, a food merchant delivered boxes of preserves, cheeses, and bottles of imported wine. As he climbed the small hill toward the mansion, he noticed that the door to the secondary basement was ajar, something that, according to him, had never happened before. The merchant reported that as he approached, he heard the distinct sound of wood being locked from the inside. A firm female voice said only, "Don't come back here." He obeyed and never mentioned the incident again until he was interviewed 22 years later. Despite this, none of it prevented the banquet from being announced as usual. The 19 confirmed guests included merchants, well-known travelers, 2 neighboring families, and an itinerant teacher who spent seasons in Redmoor. One relevant detail: many of them were discreet people with no close relatives or much circulation outside the county, a characteristic that later made it even more difficult to trace their stories. If there was tension inside the house, it was skillfully mixed with an appearance of impeccable formality. The Ashburys never showed any public signs of disorder or conflict. No arguments were recorded. No administrative anomalies appeared in official documents. But to the attentive observer, something in the sisters' gestures, especially Clara's, revealed a kind of silent urgency. A neighbor reported that 2 days before the event, she saw the young woman standing in front of the basement entrance, as if trying to decide whether to go in or run away. Then she simply turned and went back inside without saying a word. As winter deepened its silence, the Ashbury home seemed increasingly withdrawn from the world. The windows remained closed, snow piled up in thick layers, and the wind often drowned out the sounds that would normally carry across the countryside. It was in this context, a rigid daily routine, an overly disciplined family, and a basement that no one was allowed to open, that the 19 guests accepted the invitation to the 1876 banquet, and all of them, without exception, would be seen for the last time crossing the iron gate of that property. What happened after that does not appear in conventional records. Only fragments, vague testimonies, and yellowed pages suggest that the night of the banquet was not a celebration, but rather the culmination of something that had been in preparation for weeks, perhaps months. When the night of the banquet finally arrived, Redmoor County was covered in a thick layer of snow that reflected the dim light of late afternoon as a pale glow over the land. The wind had died down, but the cold remained stiff, almost motionless. Documents describe this January 29th, 1876, as a strangely quiet night, and many of the few residents still on the roads noticed that the chimneys of the Ashbury mansion were emitting more smoke than usual, a sign that the interior was warm and ready to host the annual ceremony. Guests began arriving around 6 in the evening. Eloise's notes record each arrival, as she always did. Names, times, quick observations about coats, greetings, and brief formalities. Nothing to suggest tension. However, accounts reconstructed years later point to minor disagreements. Some guests mentioned that Clara welcomed them with unusual cordiality, while others said she seemed distracted, almost distressed, glancing toward the east corridor, the one that was supposed to remain locked. The great hall was lit by lamps attached to the stone walls. The yellowish glow cast long shadows, outlining the antique frames and dark furniture. The atmosphere, though elegant, had an inexplicable coldness to it. Perhaps it was the lack of conversation. Perhaps it was the absence of the patriarch, Edmund Ashbury, who, according to the sisters, was resting ill in the north wing. No guest saw him that night. At 7 o'clock sharp, Margaret announced the start of the banquet. Everything followed an ancient ritual, a discreet blessing, the introduction of the dishes, a brief presentation of the sisters as hosts, and the opening of imported wines. The accounts of 2 indirect survivors, people who were not in the house but claimed to have heard part of the events from outside, describe restrained laughter, cutlery clinking against porcelain, and polite murmurs filling the hall. But around 8:30, something changed. The lamp closest to the east corridor began to flicker, oscillating in a back and forth of dim light that drew attention. The flame rose and fell as if fighting against an invisible draft. Some guests commented on the phenomenon casually. Eloise, however, quickly noted in her notebook that it should be checked later, even though the hallway had been locked since early in the evening, according to Margaret. The mood did not break, but a feeling of discomfort began to spread slowly, like a silent tide. One of the guests, Mrs. Turner, reported years later to a researcher that she had the impression that the sisters heard something that no one else heard. She could not explain it any further. She only mentioned sudden changes in Margaret's gaze and how Clara seemed to hold her breath from time to time, as if waiting for some sign. Dinner continued until 9 o'clock. After the meal, as was tradition, the guests were invited to circulate around the house, chat in small groups, and play card games in the secondary hall. It was at this point that the first discrepancy was noted. 3 guests looked for the bathroom in the east wing and found the door locked with internal bolts, something unusual for a reception evening. When they asked Eloise, she simply replied with apparent calm, "No one goes in there today." That phrase, according to a statement taken in 1901, marked the beginning of a broader unease. Some guests, intrigued by the restriction, began to ask discreet questions. Others simply avoided any comment, aware that internal matters of the Ashbury family were not discussed in public. Shortly before 9:30, a sharp noise echoed from the lower floor, a crack of wood loud enough to be heard in the main hall. The lamps flickered, some vases vibrated slightly, and silence fell for a few seconds. Margaret, maintaining her composure, simply said, "The old foundation reacts to the cold." Nothing more. But the glance exchanged quickly between her and Clara indicated that the sound was not normal. Later reports, reconstructed by neighbors who claimed to have passed by the property that night, mention muffled sounds, not screams, not footsteps, but something similar to the movement of several people trying to communicate through thick wood. Nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest that the secondary basement, until then only mentioned in inventories, was being used at that very moment. Around 10 o'clock at night, the atmosphere was no longer the same. Guests began to comment to each other about the sisters' stiffness, the absence of the patriarch, the unusually tense atmosphere. Clara, in particular, seemed about to reveal something. She approached the groups, took 2 steps, hesitated, and backed away. Researchers believe she was trying to warn someone, but did not know how to do so without completely breaking the control imposed by the older sisters. At 10:20, an incident interrupted the order of the evening once and for all. The lamp in the east corridor went out completely. The room was plunged into a dim light. The shadows took on new contours, and the door to the corridor, previously locked, opened a few inches, creaking slowly and involuntarily. The guests turned around almost simultaneously. Margaret, pale, crossed the hall with firm steps and pushed the door back, closing it forcefully. Then she turned, and in a voice harder than any witness had ever heard, said, "Please return to the main hall. Dinner is not over yet." That was Margaret's last recorded sentence that night. From that moment on, the accounts become fragmented. Some testimonies suggest that the guests began to directly question what was happening in the basement. Others mention a smell of burning wood coming from under the house. One of the travelers claimed to have heard rhythmic knocking, as if someone were keeping time inside the underground structure. Eloise, according to contradictory reports, went up to the second floor and disappeared for a few minutes, long enough for Clara to whisper to one of the closest guests, "Don't go down there. What you see must not be seen." This phrase, reproduced in different tones by various witnesses, became the most repeated throughout the subsequent investigation. The climax of the reconstruction comes at 10:47 p.m. when witnesses report that the door to the secondary basement opened abruptly, as if the entire structure had collapsed. There is no visual record, only auditory descriptions. A deep crack, wood breaking, lamps swaying, cold wind invading the hall. No one saw the interior clearly, only shadows, only movement, then chaos. The documents do not describe a rush, but rather a kind of suspension, as if everyone had been overcome by absolute silence. One witness claims to have felt as if the floor was pulling the air out of the room. Another mentions seeing Clara fall to her knees, her hands covering her face. After that, nothing. None of the 19 guests were ever seen again. The most disturbing record of that night, however, is not a human testimony. It is a single sentence written by Eloise, found in a closed notebook, recovered weeks after the sisters' disappearance. The sentence, incomplete, ends abruptly. They went down before I could stop them, and it is here, in this historical gap, that the climax ends. The night remains unanswered, and the basement remains as the last door that should not have been opened. The morning after the banquet brought a pale, silent light over Redmoor. The snow reflected the weak winter sun, but around the Ashbury estate there was something that, according to later reports, seemed like a strange emptiness, as if the previous night had erased part of the world. No movement could be seen in the mansion. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no voices echoed in the surroundings. The first to notice something was wrong was the milkman, who always arrived before 7. He found the main gate ajar, marked by old footprints, almost all of them erased by the early morning snow. However, what caught his attention was not the footprints, but the absence of any sign from inside. He called for Clara, as he always did, then for Margaret, then for Eloise. There was no answer. Only the wind responded, dragging a hollow sound between the closed windows. Concerned, the delivery man sought out 2 neighbors, and together they returned to the property shortly before 8. The main hall was in order, chairs in place, plates stacked, glasses intact. There was no sign of a struggle, disorder, or rush. The lamps, now extinguished, still exuded the faint smell of burnt oil. Everything was as it should be after a banquet, except that there was no one there. The county police were called. Sheriff Samuel Norris, known for his rigorous investigations, recorded in his initial statement, "There are no bodies. There is no blood. There are no signs of escape. There are no signs that a single person has crossed these doors since the end of the night." What he did not write, but mentioned informally days later, was that upon entering the mansion, he felt a too heavy silence, almost physical, as if the air had become thick. The search lasted 3 days. They examined every room, every closet, every corner of the second floor and the attic. They found the sisters' clothes, personal belongings, notebooks, and books. Their father, Edmund, was not in his bed, although his belongings remained there. There were no drag marks, nor any evidence that he had left on his own. The fireplace still held dark embers from the night before. It was only on the 4th day of searching that the secondary basement was finally opened. The door was partially damaged, as if something or someone had forced the structure open. Investigators descended with lanterns, noting a lower temperature than in the rest of the house and a faint smell of wet wood. The stone walls were intact, but the floor showed irregular marks, like old scratches mixed with the recent marks from heavy objects being dragged. They found no bodies. They found no clothes. They found no tools, weapons, or any items that suggested a violent act. Just an empty, large, cold space, and completely incomprehensible from a functional point of view. It was difficult to determine what it was used for, other than the name found in the inventories, Silent Punishment Cellar. Norris described the place as more symbolic than practical, but did not elaborate on what he meant by that. Some researchers believe he was referring to the unusual shape of the room, a kind of semi-arch, which had a deeper central area, accessible by 3 steps. This sunken area appeared to have been used recently, although there was no concrete indication of what for. One detail caught their attention. Under one of the stones near the north wall, there was a piece of dark blue fabric stuck between 2 blocks. It was the same material used in the sisters' dresses, according to the local seamstress. There was no blood, no dirt, just the silent presence of something that shouldn't have been there. Interviews with residents began. Some claimed to have seen lights turning off and on at the property at unusual times months before the banquet. Others mentioned muffled sounds coming from the ground, as if the house had a heart that beat slowly, said a woodcutter. Nothing was conclusive. Nothing pointed in a clear direction. However, one specific statement changed the course of the investigation. Mrs. Harriet Lowe, a distant neighbor, reported that on the afternoon before the banquet, Clara Ashbury stopped by her door. She didn't ask for food. She didn't ask for help. She didn't talk about the event. She just said, "If I don't come back tomorrow, remember that I tried. Harriet, elderly at the time, interpreted the phrase as an outburst of emotional exhaustion. Only later did she realize the exact weight of those words. The police pressed the community for clues, but Redmoor was a place of long silences. Many avoided talking about the Ashbury family, some out of respect, others out of fear, and most because they simply knew nothing concrete. The sisters were never ones to confide in others. Their father rarely appeared. The house functioned as a world unto itself, governed by private rules that few people knew. With no bodies, no material evidence, and 19 people missing, the authorities concluded that this was an unprecedented event, but were unable to classify it as a crime. The investigation was officially closed in 1879, but some papers remained hidden and only surfaced decades later when the county archives were reorganized. Among these papers was a note from Eloise herself, probably written on the morning of the banquet. The handwriting is steady at the beginning but breaks down in the last few lines. The complete text, though short, is the most disturbing of all the preserved documents. Today, we delivered what was always demanded of us. The cold is not what frightens us. Silence is what imprisons us. Let no one come down tonight. There will be no return. The final sentence, crossed out but still legible, contained only 2 words: forgive us. This note, combined with fragmented reports of noises in the basement and strange behavior by the sisters in the weeks leading up to the banquet, formed the basis of a historical hypothesis that researchers consider the most plausible, not definitive, but emotionally coherent. The Ashbury sisters, under pressure from an authoritarian father and strict family traditions, may have conducted some kind of extreme disciplinary ritual involving the guests. Something planned, silent, and deeply wrong. But if this hypothesis is true, it only explains the intention. It does not explain the absence of bodies. It does not explain how 19 people disappeared without a trace. And it doesn't explain why the patriarch was never found. The Ashbury case thus remains suspended between the factual and the incomplete, a set of evidence that comes close to the truth, but never reaches it. The only consensus among historians is this: that night, something got completely out of control, and whatever happened in the basement, it didn't come back to tell the tale. Decades have passed since that winter night in 1876, and even today the Ashbury case rests among the yellowed pages of the Redmoor archives like a scar that the county avoids touching. It is curious to note how time, so patient, so relentless, does not erase certain events. It merely covers them with layers of silence, waiting for someone, someday, to have the courage to lift them carefully. I am just a researcher, a belated chronicler trying to reconstruct fragments that the wind has carried away. I spent years consulting irregular documents, forgotten testimonies, frayed notebooks, and letters that should never have survived the winter of that century. All I found were outlines, shadows of gestures, echoes of conversations we will never hear, interrupted lines that guard their reasons like someone guarding wounds. And it was in the gaps, much more than in the evidence, that I realized what really remains standing in this case. It is not the mystery of the basement. It is not the disappearance of the 19 guests. It is not even the absence of the patriarch Edmund Ashbury, whose name disappears from the records like a torn page. What remains is the deep sense that everyone involved, sisters, guests, neighbors, investigators, carried a particular kind of fear. Not the fear of the unknown, as they say, but a more human and silent fear. The fear of breaking with traditions that preceded them. The fear of contradicting structures that seemed larger than their own lives. The fear of recognizing that there were limits within their homes, their families, and themselves. Margaret, with her rigidity, was perhaps not just strict. Perhaps she was exhausted. Eloise, with her meticulous notes, was perhaps trying to maintain control over something that was already slipping through her fingers. Clara, with her sweet and restless hesitation, was perhaps the only one who realized, too soon, that nothing could stop what was about to happen. The basement, so often mentioned and so little understood, needs no supernatural explanations. It belongs to a time when silence was a discipline and obedience was a duty, even when both produced invisible scars. It was a space built to punish, but also in a way to hide. When I revisit the testimonies and the few pieces of evidence that have been preserved, I realize that the disappearance of the 19 guests is not a mystery about doors that open by themselves or footsteps in the dark. It is a mystery about responsibility, about human fragility in the face of crushing structures, impossible expectations, traditions that demand sacrifices that no one should have to make. And perhaps that is why no definitive answer has emerged. Perhaps deep down, Redmoor never wanted to close this case, not for lack of evidence, but for fear of acknowledging that what happened that night was not the result of chance, nor of an isolated deviation, but part of a silent and relentless social system, repeated in so many other homes in the 19th century. The official files closed the investigation in 1879. The newspapers published short, formal notes. The families of the missing, few and far between, dissolved over time. The voices that still tried to remember became whispers, and little by little, the Ashbury house was covered by weeds, snow, and moss, until nothing remained but its stone foundation, cold, immobile, and empty. Even so, when I walk through the surviving records and memories, I always return to the same point, the final sentence of Eloise's note. There is no way to read it without feeling the exact weight it carried. Forgive us. It is not a phrase of guilt. It is not a confession. It is, above all, a request, a small, intimate, and devastating gesture, as if she knew that all of this was beyond her understanding, her fears, and her limits. Today, more than a century after their disappearance, Redmoor Estate no longer exists. Snow covers what remains of the land. The wind blows through the valley unimpeded. The earth keeps its secrets with the patience of those who have forgotten human haste. And yet every time I read the testimonies from that time, I feel as if part of that night has never ended. Because there are stories that never end. There are silences that cannot be broken. And there are questions that were never meant to be answered. The Ashbury case remains just that. A void surrounded by documents, an echo trapped in walls that no longer exist, an absence that refuses to disappear. And at the end of this reconstruction, all that remains is the feeling that, in Redmoor, in that winter of 1876, no one really came home.